you, Anne, for inviting me. So there goes Anne. Okay. Well, I think this is the third time I've been down to the library. Each of the previous occasions was commemorating some special event in conservation history. So in 2014, I was down with you commemorating the 100th anniversary of the passenger pigeon's extinction. In 2016, it was commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Migratory Bird Treaty. And this year, no special anniversary, but at least a very visible conservation issue with the conservation of the monarch butterfly. And tonight, I'm going to talk a bit about monarch butterflies, but also link it to Aldo Leopold and especially his ideas about private land ownership and the ethics of conservation. Because as you'll see, the future of the monarch butterfly very much depends on the behavior of private landowners. So the title slide here is, of course, of Aldo Leopold's shack, the setting for the first half of his book, A Sand County Almanac. And for Aldo Leopold, we've encountered our first problem. So for those of you, and I assume since it's a Wisconsin audience, many of you have read Aldo Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac. You are, of course, well aware of the impact that that book has had on conservation. And it is rather interesting that in the introduction to the book, Leopold had this to say, that the book is essentially the end result of his life journey, describing his career in conservation and his ideas, essentially, about how to make conservation work on the American landscape. So one of Leopold's big ideas that he introduced in the Sand County Almanac was probably his most important idea, which was the idea of a land ethic. Well, this is kind of frustrating that it's not letting me advance my slides. We'll just have to do it manually, I guess. So a quick summary of how Leopold got to that end result of his life journey. He's a Midwesterner, born in Iowa, and spends his youth as an outdoor kid hunting and fishing, bird watching, doing natural history studies. He pursued forestry as a career, although that was an important part of the first half of his career, his real passion wasn't for forestry, it was for wildlife conservation. But he does spend the first half of his career working for the U.S. Forest Service on publicly owned wildlands in Arizona and New Mexico. But in mid-career, he makes a rather bold move and quits the Forest Service and decides to pursue his real passion in wildlife conservation, which brings him back to the Midwest, where he'll spend the second half of his career, much of it as a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And in the Midwest, he's confronted with a very different landscape than he had to deal with in the Southwest. Rather than having publicly owned land that Leopold, as a chief forester, was pretty much in charge of, here in the Midwest, he had to deal with lots of private landowners to get conservation practices enacted. But in any event, the end result of his life journey, as he describes it here, is looking at our relationship with land. And for Leopold, land is the word that he uses for the ecosystem, the environment, nature in general. And it was this that really was the work of the second half of his career, was figuring out how to get our relationship with the land on an even keel. So he quits the Forest Service in 1928, which in itself was a rather bold or foolish, depending on your outlook, thing to do in 1928. It was Great Depression. Leopold had a high-paying, secure government job in the Forest Service, and he pretty much quits cold turkey without knowing exactly what he was going to do next. But what he did next was to take on a contract job that required him to travel around the upper Midwest to do probably the very first on-the-ground assessment of the status of wildlife and wildlife conservation measures. And as you can see on the map, he traveled extensively during these 3 years, visiting the 8 north central states and taking stock of what he found in the way of the status of wildlife and wildlife conservation measures. And he wrote this report up in 1931. And a big part of his conclusion about the abysmal state of wildlife populations at the time and the almost non-existent conservation measures was that the crux to the problem is on the farm, that it was basically private landowners who were controlling the future of wildlife, especially in this case, game populations. And as he concluded, there could be no solution until conservation practices are habitual on private lands. This was an almost inevitable conclusion because, of course, almost all of the upper Midwest that he traveled was in private hands, and much of it was working lands. So based on that experience and other things that he was doing, in 1933, Leopold publishes a blockbuster book. In 1933, he published this book, Game Management, which introduced to the world, really, an entirely new approach to wildlife conservation. Prior to this, wildlife conservation was entirely based on protection, that you had to protect wildlife from human beings. And Leopold sort of turned that on its head, especially after what he had seen around the Midwest, and said, no, it really has to do with management, especially the management of wildlife habitat, that conservation is a problem of management as well as protection. Well, this book obviously put Leopold right at the pinnacle of the profession, and the University of Wisconsin in 1933 did something which, again, was kind of an unprecedented move. They gave Leopold a professorship in wildlife conservation. And it was special because it was the first such position anywhere in the world at any university that was devoted to this new idea of wildlife management. And for Leopold, obviously, this was a wonderful opportunity for him to have the academic freedom to explore his new ideas about how to achieve conservation. But it was a pretty bold move on the part of the University of Wisconsin. You have to imagine that 1933 was still the tail end of the Great Depression. The university's budget had to be in pretty bad shape. Here was this guy, Aldo Leopold, who had no PhD, who had never taught a course in his life, and who represented a field that had never before been present in the halls of academia. So it was really a rather bold move on the part of the College of Agriculture to offer him this precious faculty position during lean times. And the dean of the college at the time, of course, asked Aldo Leopold, well, can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to do with this new professorship that we've given you? And I think the dean was probably a little surprised by some of the things that Aldo Leopold said, including this, that he wanted to devote his professorship to the development of some vehicle whereby the community can prevent the abuse of private land and encourage uses which are in the public interest. Well, that didn't sound probably at first blush very much like wildlife management, but Leopold knew that this was really the core of the problem that he was going to have to be confronting. And for Leopold, it really was the crux of the problem. And for any of you who are familiar with Leopold's writings and perhaps have read some of his essays beyond a Sand County Almanac, You'll know that when Leopold starts a paragraph with the crux to the problem, you should really pay attention, because usually what he's going to do in the following sentences is really lay out the fundamental issue that he feels needs to be addressed. And in this case, the crux to the problem is that every landowner is the custodian of two interests, not always identical, the public and his own. What we need is a positive inducement or reward for the landowner who respects both interests in his actual land practice. And this is the important thing. All conservation problems, erosion, forestry, game, wildflowers, landscapes, and I would add butterflies, ultimately boil down to this: the behavior of private landowners and how they treat the land that they're responsible for. So Leopold quickly decided that private landowners were going to have to be part of the solution, but he needed to explain exactly what the solution looked like. And for him, it was easy to sum it up in what he hoped would be an easily understood sort of idea, concept of healthy land. People understood what health and sickness was. He hoped to show them by example what healthy land looked like and what sick land looked like, unhealthy land. So conservation is a state of health in the land. The land consists of soil, water, plants, and animals, but land health is more than the sufficiency of these components. It is a state of vigorous self-renewal in each of them and in all collectively. The land must, of course, be modified, but it should be modified as gently and as little as possible. So Leopold has sort of laid out the scope here, that the objective is of conservation is healthy land, and private landowners are going to be a big part of the solution. So he recognizes the challenge that he faces. And a big one that is hard to get around is the fact that, at least here in the United States, with our history of private land ownership and private property rights, is that we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. And that's a big hurdle to get over, to make conservation somehow consistent with our strong history of private property rights and respecting the independence and economic needs of the landowners, especially in the agricultural community. So Leopold, as a sort of an experimenter, you might say, goes through a series of, let's see whether this might work. And he starts out initially thinking that regulations might be the way to achieve land health on private land. This is not surprising, given that he came from the first half of his career in a federal agency where this is how you did things. You basically implemented change through regulations. So Leopold's initial ideas about land health on private land involved regulations, and he came out with some pretty strong statements. Ultimately, the use of all resources will have to be put under public regulation, regardless of ownership. Well, this was before he did his tour of the upper Midwest. And after doing that tour, I'm sure he got a pretty good idea of how the private landowners of the upper Midwest were going to respond to this type of approach to conservation. So Leopold quickly changed his course, and throughout his career, he was not shy about abandoning an idea that proved to be unworkable and just moving on. So just a few years later, all the regulations in the world will not save our game unless the farmer sees fit to leave his land in a habitable condition for game. So regulations are important, but they certainly are not going to be the only approach or the silver bullet that's going to achieve land health. So especially after he joins the faculty of the University of Wisconsin and gets involved in some of the New Deal work on conservation on private lands, he thinks that perhaps economic incentives are the way to achieve land health. And at least for a time, he's quite enthusiastic about this. He participated in the first watershed scale conservation project in the US in Coon Valley in Wisconsin. And at least while the federal government subsidies kept flowing, those economic incentives did achieve conservation. And Leopold was impressed. Conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. But he quickly observed that once those incentives and subsidies go away, things go right back to their old ways. The painless path of incentives and subsidies not only fails to lead us to land conservation, but sometimes actually retards the growth of critical intelligence on the whereabouts of alternative routes. Well, at this point, the toolkit was empty. Those were the only tool approaches that had been used at that time to try to achieve conservation on private land. So Leopold recognized that something new had to be done because neither of these alone by themselves or even in combination was going to be enough. And he acknowledges as much. We tried to get conservation by buying land, by subsidizing desirable changes in land use, and by passing restrictive laws. The last method largely failed. The other two have produced only small samples of success. So Leopold had to come up with something new, and that something new was an ethical approach to conservation. We seem ultimately always throwing back on individual ethics as the basis of land conservation. It's hard to make a man by pressure of law or money do a thing which does not spring naturally from his own personal sense of right and wrong. And this is where Leopold would focus his considerable intellectual skills and communication skills for most of the second half of his life, how to pursue this idea of an ethical relationship with nature. And he recognized that at the time when he was coming up with this idea, that this was new ground. As he said, there is as yet no social stigma in the possession of a gullied farm, a wrecked forest, or a polluted stream, provided the dividends suffice to send the youngsters to college. So he was really going to be attempting to bring an entirely new ethical framework to private land ownership. And he frames this in terms of what he called a land ethic. The land ethic for which he is so rightly famous is this idea borrowed from both sociology and ecology, that in the same way that we human beings recognize that we are part of a human community and that there have to be some ethical guidelines, a moral compass, if you will, to guide our behavior within that human community, in the same way we're members of an ecological community, and there has to be a moral compass that guides our behavior within that community as well. And he says, the land ethic then reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, and this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. So the land ethic was Leopold's solution. This is what he decided was going to be the approach that was ultimately going to turn things around, to basically get private landowners to do the right thing on their land, not because they're forced to by regulations or coerced to do so by subsidies, but because it's simply the right thing to do. And although Leopold died in 1948, just as he was really formulating the details of his land ethic, he didn't get to explore it further, but he did leave us what is often thought of as a golden rule about land health and the responsibilities of land ownership. Quit thinking about decent land use solely as an economic problem. Examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. And here's the golden rule. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. A good sort of guideline to make decisions about how land is managed. So where have we come since Leopold's time? Obviously, The environmental movement of the 1960s and into our time places a lot of emphasis on ethics of people doing the right thing, because it simply is morally the right thing to do with respect to the environment and nature. And as Leopold observed almost a century ago now, private land is still critically important to achieving conservation goals. Almost 3/4 of the land in the lower 48 states is in private ownership. And most of that is productive land that's used for farming, for ranching, for forestry. It's working landscapes, the type of landscape that Leopold was most focused on during his time. We also know that private land, although it's important for people to make their livelihood on, that it has some implications for what happens off of that land that individuals own. About 88% of the precipitation that falls in the US falls on private lands. And of course, that water doesn't stay there. It runs into our rivers, it accumulates all of the things that have run off of that private land, and eventually ends up being a very public problem as our waterways are polluted. We also know that private lands are increasingly important for providing habitat for threatened and endangered species. Some 40% of threatened and endangered species in the US are found only on privately owned land. So their continued existence depends on whether the private landowners continue to provide the habitat and other features that these species require to survive. And unfortunately, the privately owned land that's in a natural or semi-natural state is being lost. Some 2 million acres a year are being lost to some more intensive type of development, often putting into agricultural production, being put into more commercial forestry that does not provide the types of semi-natural or natural habitats that biodiversity depends on. So Leopold's ideas about the importance of private land ownership for conservation goals is as true today as it has ever been. Which brings us to the species that is to be highlighted tonight, and that is the monarch butterfly. Like many other species, the monarch butterfly is a perfect example of a species whose future existence is going to depend almost entirely on the behavior of private landowners. This is not a species that we can save by working only on publicly owned land. The future of the monarch butterfly really does depend on what happens on private lands. And therefore, Aldo Leopold's ideas about the ethics, the morals, the responsibilities that private landowners have toward a species like the monarch butterfly are extremely important and relevant to its conservation. So the monarch butterfly, at least in recent years, has become something of the poster species for private land conservation. And it's because the monarch butterfly has suffered such a dramatic decline and such a severe decline that worries about it going extinct were not completely unfounded. As most of you probably know, monarch butterflies have a fascinating life cycle. It's a life cycle that many people are intimately familiar with because monarch butterflies were a common feature in school science classes where students collected monarch butterflies, fed them milkweed leaves, watched the caterpillars mature, form a chrysalis, and eventually emerge as a beautiful butterfly that flew off and engaged on this incredibly long distance migration. So the fascinating part of the monarch's life cycle has made it sort of an endeared species to many Americans. It's certainly a species that was once so common that virtually everyone knew about the monarch butterfly. So the monarch butterfly's life cycle plays out principally on private lands. and it involves a very complicated annual cycle. If we pick up the annual cycle where the monarch butterfly is on this circular graph, they spend the winter in Mexico in very special habitats that provide the right temperature and the right humidity for the butterflies to make it over the winter season, and then in spring start to work their way north. As they begin working their way north in early spring, they breed in the southern US. And the first sort of generation of monarch butterflies born each year are actually born in the extreme southern US, in Texas and Oklahoma. That generation of butterflies then moves further north, and a second generation of butterflies are born. They're basically the grandchildren of the butterflies that survived over the winter. And as the second generation hatches and matures, they fly further north. And eventually the third and fourth and sometimes even the fifth generation of monarch butterflies are continuing to swell the numbers, so that throughout this process, the key factor really in the monarch's complicated life cycle working is their ability to reproduce prolifically, so that each generation pumps out large numbers of offspring. And as you go through these successive generations that are working their way northward, the numbers swell and swell and swell until by the time fall comes and it's time for that last generation to head south on that long and perilous migration, that there are enough butterflies heading south that enough of them will make it to the wintering areas in Mexico so that they can survive the winter and begin the cycle again the following year. Well, this complicated life cycle obviously was a winning strategy for monarch butterflies for millennia. It worked, but it was all dependent largely on their ability to reproduce prolifically. Anything that interfered with their ability to produce prodigious numbers of offspring would make this life cycle essentially untenable, because there would not be enough individuals to make that long migration south and to survive the long winter. So this complicated play takes place on a stage that is largely our part of the world. It's the central US and especially the upper Midwest. The primary wintering areas for monarch butterflies down near Mexico City in the higher elevation coniferous forests. When the monarchs leave, their first destination is the initial breeding ground, which is in Texas and Oklahoma, the area in the southernmost red circle here. It's there that the first and second generations of monarch butterflies are born and steadily work their way north. The third, fourth, and sometimes fifth generations of monarch butterflies actually happen in our area, in the upper Midwest and southern Canada. So this is a really crucial part of that life cycle. We are essentially the location that is producing that large number of individuals that are going to have to make the journey south. So within this area in which all of this activity happens, it's often referred to as the monarch milkweed corridor. And it's indicated here by the black dotted lines. It's an area in which this complicated life cycle plays out. So what happens within that monarch milkweed corridor is really crucial. And as you certainly recognize, most of the land within this corridor is in private ownership. So we call it the monarch milkweed corridor because milkweed is, of course, an incredibly important part of the monarch's life cycle. Their larvae depend on milkweed, as the sole source, the primary source of food for their caterpillars to develop. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that this is the corridor in which monarch butterflies undergo this complicated life cycle. This is really a hotspot for milkweeds. There are a lot of milkweeds in this area, which provides the monarch butterflies with lots of opportunities to do that crucial reproduction and be successful at it. Probably most people are familiar with the common milkweed that is often regarded as a weed, but most people are not really fully aware of the diversity of milkweeds that we have here in the Midwest. Wisconsin, for example, has 14 milkweed species. In addition to the common milkweed, which you're all presumably familiar with, there are 13 other species, some of which are actually endangered themselves, but that are more habitat specialists, but are nonetheless important sources of food for monarch caterpillars to develop on. So that corridor provides what the monarchs need, but whether that corridor will continue to produce the abundance of milkweed that's necessary for monarch butterflies to reproduce successfully has really become, as Leopold would say, the crux of the problem. We know that monarch butterflies are not doing well. We know that it's been alarming how quickly they have declined. Since the official counts of monarch butterflies were made in the wintering area, where they can get a pretty good idea of how many monarchs there are to start the annual cycle, we've seen pretty much a steady downward trend since the sort of well-organized counts started back in the 1990s. It's not really a count necessarily, because of course there are many, many thousands of monarch butterflies in this area. But what they do is estimate the area that's occupied by the monarch butterflies and use that as an indicator of how many butterflies have packed into these relatively small areas. And you can see the alarming trend over time. Basically, the monarch has dwindled so that it's now down to well under 10% of what it had been not that long ago. So the alarm bell went off, and there were proposals, of course, several years ago that this trend was so ominous that we should hurry up and list the monarch butterfly as a threatened species, if not an endangered species. Well, this, of course, was very problematic, because if it was listed as an endangered species, it meant that the full force of the Endangered Species Act of 1973 would come into play to protect the monarch butterfly and to basically do what was necessary to prevent its extinction. And that, of course, would have meant a lot of regulatory action directed toward private lands, which, of course, is a controversial aspect of the Endangered Species Act, as many people feel that imposing regulations on private landowners to prevent the extinction of endangered species is an infringement on property rights. So this would have been a very controversial, but perhaps necessary move. But when we looked at what was really going on, it appeared that there was probably an alternative, and that gets back to Aldo Leopold and his ideas about engaging private landowners to do the right thing on their land, not because you're forcing them to by endangered species regulations or paying them off to do it, but because it's simply the right thing to do. And with the popularity of monarch butterflies, the monarch butterfly seemed to be an ideal candidate whose future could be ensured, because private landowners might be inclined to help a very charismatic species like this. And it really was going to be a problem that had to be solved on private lands. When you look at that monarch milkweed corridor, that light pale green is all private lands. And you can see how very little publicly owned lands there actually are within that area. And indeed, most of the publicly owned lands that are within that area are forests that are not necessarily going to provide very much habitat for an open country species like the monarch butterfly. So basically, inducing private landowners to do the right thing on their land was a way of perhaps avoiding the conflicts that would come from listing the monarch butterfly as a threatened species. And things are not going well for monarch butterflies in that corridor. A number of problems have popped up, especially in recent years, that have made life very difficult for the butterflies within this area. Climate change, of course, has had its impact in a couple of ways. There have been severe droughts in the southern portion of the monarch's breeding range in Texas and Oklahoma. That's where that first generation is going to get its start and sort of start the entire annual cycle off again. With those severe droughts, milkweeds were not as abundant on the landscape as they had been. And that, of course, limited monarch butterfly reproduction. As you move further north, another sort of unexpected consequence of climate change is that as seasons moderated further and further north, those fourth and fifth generations of monarch butterflies could move further and further to the north and find a suitable climate and suitable habitat. And that doesn't sound so bad, except that by moving further north, their wintering area in Mexico remains fixed. So by moving further and further north for those final generations of the year, it means that they now have a longer migration. And it is during that long migration that a lot of the mortality of monarch butterflies happens during the year. So climate change has an impact in several ways. There's also been the conversion of natural and semi-natural places within that corridor. A lot of land that had been grassland and wetland and fallow agricultural lands that supported healthy populations of milkweeds and monarch butterflies has been converted. It's been converted largely to crops, and by converting it to crops, it denies the monarchs, again, of the habitat and the food supply that their developing caterpillars need. So the continued loss of areas that in the past might have been useful to monarch butterflies amounts to tens of thousands of square miles. And it's a loss that really does reduce the possibility for monarchs to do that sort of prolific reproduction that's so important. And then there's what happens on that land that's converted largely to agriculture. And one of the problems that has been in the forefront of understanding the decline of the monarch butterfly has happened in our area. Here in the north central states, where the fourth and fifth generations of monarchs are going to be born. And that is that we've converted a lot of the agricultural land to increasingly intensive production of corn and soybeans. And if that wasn't bad enough, we also are now producing herbicide-resistant forms of some of these crops that allow farmers to apply herbicides that reduce the presence of weeds, as they're often referred to, like milkweed, from much of the agricultural landscape. So in addition to just the conversion of pasture lands and more open semi-natural habitats to intensive row crops has reduced the habitat, and then the application of herbicides like Roundup and glyphosate type herbicides has resulted in those agricultural lands producing even fewer milkweeds than they might have otherwise been capable of producing. So all in all, the last half century has not been kind to monarch butterflies. So many things have basically gone wrong for them. And many of those things that have changed for the monarch butterflies, of course, hit them where they're most vulnerable. They're the changes that actually prevent the monarch butterfly from achieving that prolific reproductive output that's absolutely essential for their life cycle to be successful. So it brings us to the crux of the problem is what can be done on private lands to turn things around for the monarch butterfly. Obviously, the key here is to expand the habitat that the monarchs need to reproduce. We need to have more milkweeds on the landscape. We need to have more nectar-producing plants that the butterflies can feed on. So we need to have basically some changes in the way a lot of private land is being managed so that it can make way for an expansion of the monarch population. And it happens in a number of places. Backyards and parks are places, for example, that could easily produce milkweeds for reproduction, that could produce nectar-producing plants for feeding the adults. There are other places as well, the edges of farm fields that aren't being intensively used for crops. Those are entirely on private lands, and those are areas that have traditionally been a place where milkweeds thrive. And as long as farmers leave those areas free of herbicides so that they can continue to produce milkweeds and nectar-producing plants, that's a huge benefit rather than herbiciding them to keep the farm free of so-called weeds. There's also lots of fallow land that if it is managed in the right way, if it's seeded with plants that will be useful to monarch butterflies, milkweeds, and nectar-producing plants, fallow lands that are not being intensively used can be an extremely important part of the solution. And then there are some interesting opportunities that are often overlooked. Public right-of-ways are very important throughout the monarch milkweed corridor. There are a lot of these places that are in public ownership, but that are currently being managed in ways that do not provide the right type of habitat for monarch butterflies. They're intensely managed, just not in such a way that they provide what monarch butterflies need. Some very minor changes in the way these right-of-ways are managed could make them useful for monarch butterflies. There are also privately owned right-of-ways that, again, are now managed in ways that are not particularly helpful to monarch butterflies, but with some very minor changes in the way we manage those areas could provide a significant area of habitat. So let's look at some of these. On basically people's yards and parks, these are places where landscaping with native wildflowers has become quite popular, and producing milkweeds, producing nectar-producing flowers has been an important part of native wildflower landscaping because people are concerned about the monarch butterfly, because many of these native wildflowers are very attractive. People are often inclined to want to basically plant their yards, landscape their property with plants that'll be useful to species like the monarch butterfly. There's a lot of that land, of course, that if it was something other than mowed Kentucky bluegrass lawns, could actually be contributing substantially to the amount of habitat that's available both for caterpillars to feed on and for adults to feed on. The edges of farm fields. This is really important because milkweeds were often considered a serious pest, weed, in agriculture in the upper Midwest. That's because milkweeds, kind of like monarch butterflies, They produce prolific seeds that, of course, drift on the wind. And if they land on bare soil, they can germinate and turn into a milkweed plant. They have to, though, land on bare soil. And that meant that milkweed seeds drifting around the landscape on the wind often found the best places for germination were plowed fields. So milkweeds became a common feature of the agricultural landscape, treated largely as weeds when they were in the crop areas, but in the areas around the edges of farm fields, where there's often bare soil exposed, milkweeds were often quite abundant there. With the advent of easy and cheap herbicides, farmers often chose to eliminate what they viewed as weeds in those areas along the edges of fields. There's also fallow lands. A lot of the agricultural land is fallow in any given year. And again, if that can be allowed to produce milkweeds and other nectar-producing plants, that's quite a contribution toward habitat for monarch butterflies. The somewhat overlooked areas are things like highway right-of-ways. Most people, of course, know how much habitat is out there in these right-of-ways. It's about 40 acres of right-of-way per mile of divided highway. So it adds up pretty quickly. And of course, as we all know, those areas are often managed in such a way that they're virtually useless for wildlife. It would, however, be quite easy and not that expensive to convert those areas from being frequently mowed sort of habitat deserts to areas that could produce what species like monarch butterflies need. And there certainly are programs now underway to plant roadsides, the right-of-ways, with milkweeds and nectar-producing plants. And when you look across the monarch milkweed corridor, you start to realize that there's over 8,000 square miles of highway right-of-ways within this area. So there's a huge area that, if it was managed in an appropriate way, could provide an abundance of habitat for monarch butterflies. And as I said, those roadside plantings and modifying mowing practices so that these plantings are capable of producing vegetation that's useful for wildlife like monarch butterflies is now actually becoming more common along our roadways, although the old practices die hard, and it has been somewhat challenging to get highway departments to go along with doing this on the scale that would really make a big difference. But it's a tremendous potential if we're willing to change the way we manage those areas. And going all the way back to Aldo Leopold's time, you know, this was not a new concept at all. Leopold observed that there are idle spots on every farm, and every highway is bordered by an idle strip as long as it is. Keep cow, plow, and mowers out of these idle spots, and the full native flora, plus dozens of interesting stowaways from foreign parts, could be part of the normal environment of every citizen. So it's been obvious for a long time that there's the potential for these areas to produce habitat, in this case, possibly for monarch butterflies. Railroad right-of-ways are another interesting possibility. Railroad right-of-ways are wide, 50 to 100 feet wide. And as many of you know, in the upper Midwest, along the right-of-ways of our rail corridors was often some of the places where native prairies persisted on the landscape because they were not plowed, because they were not treated as badly as some of the adjacent lands that had essentially their native plant species removed. So once again, if these areas were not subjected to regular applications of herbicides and mowed, they could provide quite a bit of habitat for monarch butterflies. And when you look at the monarch milkweed corridor, it's rather obvious that within this corridor, it's the highest density of major rail corridors in the country. So, you know, there's tremendous possibility here. There's about 750 square miles of major railway right-of-ways within this corridor. So a lot of good potential for managing that habitat in a slightly different way than it is now. It's already managed. We're already essentially absorbing costs to manage these areas. What we need to do is just change the management regime. Pipeline right-of-ways are another feature of the landscape that is often presents opportunities, but are currently not managed in ways that are conducive to monarch butterflies. Pipeline right-of-ways are about 50 feet wide and, of course, crisscross the country. They're open habitat that could be supporting wildflowers like milkweeds and nectar-producing plants. And once again, when you look at the monarch milkweed corridor, you look at the right-of-ways that exist for gas and liquid petroleum products, and you realize, wow, that's where the highest density of these right-of-ways exist in the country. So lots of opportunities, about 1,500 square miles of these right-of-ways, again, if they were managed in a slightly different way, could be contributing to the solution rather than being part of the problem. And we're not done yet, because there are, of course, electrical transmission lines. These are really wide. They're about 250 feet wide. And once again, the vegetation under these transmission lines are managed in ways that are not particularly conducive to supporting habitat for monarchs or other wildlife. And again, with a slight change in the way we manage the vegetation under those transmission lines could make a big difference. The transmission grid in the US, once again, it's surprising that the monarch milkweed corridor is really dense in transmission lines, about 2,500 square miles of right-of-ways that could, under the right management regime, be contributing to habitat for monarchs. So lots of opportunities. Many of those opportunities exist on private lands, and getting those opportunities taken advantage of will require the cooperation of private landowners. Obviously, a big part of it is restoring milkweed populations on private lands within that monarch milkweed corridor. That's absolutely essential for monarchs to pull off their remarkable life cycle. They simply have to have lots of milkweed in order to chug out the number of offspring required to complete that complicated cycle. It's estimated that perhaps we need something on the order of 50 million new milkweed plants per year for at least 5 years just to reverse the losses of the recent past. And that's just a sort of a back of the envelope estimate, but it gives you an idea that we need to have a lot more milkweeds out there. And if something like that is going to happen, it's going to mean we're going to have to engage with millions of owners and managers of the private lands within the monarch milkweed corridor. We need to engage with the agricultural industry to get those lands treated in such a way that they are, again, going to be capable of producing the plants that monarch butterflies need. And perhaps most pointedly, a targeted audience, we need to engage the owners and the managers of all those right-of-ways that could easily be managed in such a way that they are a help rather than a hindrance to monarch recovery. Those are areas that right now, again, we manage them just because sort of that's the way we've always managed them, but getting the change in place could make a huge difference on those areas, and it's not going to be foregoing any opportunities. It's not like you're asking a farmer to give up potentially productive land. These right-of-ways are often not producing much of anything that's of value and are simply a cost to those who own and manage those right-of-ways. So using them in a slightly different way, managing them in a different way, is not going to be a real significant burden. And as probably many of you know, the plight of the monarch butterfly has resulted in a lot of interest in helping this species. A lot of it now is coordinated through the Monarch Joint Venture. The Monarch Joint Venture is modeled after a very successful program in wildlife management, in waterfowl management, that brings together dozens and dozens of state and federal agencies, conservation groups, private landowners. It brings them together on a shared mission. In the case of waterfowl, it's managing more wetland habitat so that we can produce more waterfowl. In this case, the Monarch Joint Venture essentially is duplicating that model, but trying to produce enough habitat to support a healthy monarch population, and using them because they are such an evocative species, using them to some extent as a flagship species, a species who can attract conservation interest and cooperation from private landowners, and at the same time often benefit other species as well, especially other pollinators. So the Monarch Joint Venture now, gosh, I won't even venture a guess because the numbers change almost by the day, but it's got to be now approaching 100 or more different entities, both governmental and non-governmental and private, that are banding together to try to do things that will basically accomplish the things that I've just described on the landscape. And some of the things that they've done involve the cooperation of a lot of private citizens. The Monarch Waystations has been a very successful program. The idea here is to encourage people within that monarch milkweed corridor to do landscaping that provides opportunities for monarch butterflies. Monarch waystations in particular are places where monarchs can reproduce, but in addition, they're places that produce nectar, producing plants late in the season for the adults to use as a source of energy while they make that long flight down to the wintering area. So a lot is happening, but we've got a long ways to go. Monarch butterflies are literally still in a very precarious state, and it's going to take an expansion of the programs that are growing rapidly, but it's going to take a further expansion for these programs to really turn things around and bring an iconic species like the monarch butterfly back to where it should be. Will we succeed? Well, we're going to succeed or fail largely on the basis of what happens on private lands, especially what happens on private lands here in the Midwest. So I'm going to conclude here, getting back to Aldo Leopold, with something that he wrote just before he died, and it was in his desk at the university when he died, an unpublished manuscript, in which he correctly says, conservation, in this case conservation of the monarch butterfly, can accomplish its objectives only when it springs from an impelling conviction on the part of private landowners. We're not going to save the monarch butterfly by regulations. We're probably not going to save it by incentives and subsidies. If we save it, it's going to be because people are motivated by an ethical commitment to saving a very fascinating and beautiful species. So Anne, I'm going to end there, and you can open things up for people to ask questions and for interactions.
Great, thank you so much. If there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box.
And let me see, I think I may have to end my show to see those. So let me do that.
Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to type them in. I see one.
Let me get.
Michael asked, how did John Muir influence Aldo Leopold?
Interesting question. I'm sorry, Ann. Maybe for some reason I'm not seeing the questions show up. So if you can read them to me, that would be a big help.
Oh, excellent. Will do.
So for Aldo Leopold, he overlapped to some extent with John Muir. John Muir preceded Aldo Leopold in terms of his major contributions to conservation. But John Muir was really quite significant in terms of Leopold's thinking about wilderness. When Leopold was in the Forest Service in the first half of his career, he was responsible for managing literally millions of acres of publicly owned wildlands in Arizona and New Mexico. His boss was Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service. And Gifford Pinchot's model for the national forests was that they were to be places that produced natural resources in sustainable ways, which basically meant that they would produce timber resources, mining resources, grazing resources, and so forth, but in a very sustainable, responsible way. John Muir had a very different view of what publicly owned wildlands should be like. He thought they should be preserved as wilderness, that they should not be subjected to extraction of natural resources. So Aldo Leopold had sympathies toward John Muir, but worked for an agency that was going in a slightly different direction. So Leopold was conflicted. And for Leopold, in one of his earliest brilliant uses of language to convey a solution to a conservation dilemma, he came up with a brilliant way of making this seemingly intractable gulf between Pinchot and Muir go away. And he did it in 5 words. He wrote a very important essay, and the opening words of the essay is, "Wilderness is a resource." By doing that, he made wilderness something consistent with Pinchot's idea of publicly owned wildlands producing resources. In this case, the resource was something that is left without extraction of natural resources. So Muir definitely had an influence, but it happened very early in Leopold's career when he was very much engaged in the wilderness movement. So I see the questions have popped up now. And I see the question about the mowing. And this is unfortunately a problem of, well, that's the way we've always done it. I know for 40 years, I lived in a rural area of Dane County and engaged with the town's road crews to try to get them to change the schedules on which they mowed some of the roadsides so that milkweeds and monarchs could complete their life cycle and nesting birds could complete their life cycles. And the poor guy who ran the mower was somewhat sympathetic, but he said, I'm really torn. He said, on one hand, I understand why you want me to shift the mowing schedule, but he said, at the same time, I'm getting a lot of pressure from other people to mow, to get rid of things like wild parsnip and other really noxious weeds that I have to knock down. So it's going to be a challenge to get a change in the way they manage roadsides. And largely, it's basically changing the vegetation there, getting rid of some of those really bad invasive species that often are actually encouraged by the mowing, and replace them with more sort of sustainable plantings of prairie species and milkweeds and so forth that don't require quite so much attention to keep them from becoming a nuisance. Keep working with them, though. Oh, and I guess the other part of the question is planting milkweeds on your acreage. For a lot of people, the key, as I think I mentioned, was that a lot of people try to plant milkweeds in areas where they're not going to germinate that successfully. They really do need to have a fairly large area of bare soil in order to germinate successfully. So if you're trying to get milkweeds established on any kind of a scale, you really do almost have to plow the area or create quite a bit of bare soil to get them started. So let's see, I missed the beginning of the talk. Yes, the recording is available. Anne, is that right?
Yes, we will be posting it on the McFarland Cable YouTube channel, and I'll also be sharing it on the library's Facebook page and social media, but watch for the McFarland Cable YouTube channel. We'll be posting it there.
Actually, for the previous question too about, where to get seeds, now with the popularity of native plant landscaping and all, a lot of the nurseries in the upper Midwest are providing seeds and plants, not only of milkweeds, but nectar producing plants. And they're now readily available, and the price is actually coming down a bit. So it's usually possible to, if you can't do the collections yourself, it's usually not that hard to find a source of seeds or plants that you can use for landscaping. That's, of course, particularly attractive if you're doing a garden. It's a little less financially easy to do if you're trying to deal with many acres at a time. But once you get permanent vegetation cover in place, it becomes a lot less expensive to keep it going. Yeah, the question, does very small plantings help? Well, yes, it does. I'm absolutely surprised at how much use even tiny garden plants in town contribute. I just, after living for 40 years on 90 acres of land in rural Mazomanie, this spring I moved into Madison, close to the UW campus, and the previous homeowner had a native wildflower garden in the front yard. So this summer, I've been absolutely amazed at the diversity of pollinators that are attracted to this small, well-done planting, including monarchs that have actually laid eggs and caterpillars that have matured on the milkweeds in the garden. So yes, even the little places help. Remember, butterflies are quite mobile. They move around the landscape quite freely, and they do find these spots. It's, that old cliche, if you plant it, they will come. And yes, somebody else commented, there are almost too many organizations now for me to have mentioned individually. If you go online and look under something as like Monarch Butterfly Conservation or Pollinator Conservation, you'll find literally hundreds of organizations that have resources that you can use to be part of the solution. In many cases, it's instructions, it's help on how to get it done. In other cases, it's much more sort of direct aid that they can offer to help you get started.
Another question I see in a different Q&A section is, do the monarchs raised indoors by individuals have the same honing ability to migrate to Mexico? Is there any difference there? No, apparently not. This, of course, it's a good school project. Many of us probably did it when we were in school. Once you release the emerged adults, from that point on, they behave exactly the same way as the wild monarchs. So
The fact that they were reared in an aquarium in your home or in a classroom doesn't affect their future behavior. And of course, you know, it's every little bit helps, because you really do need to have massive numbers of monarch butterflies heading south each year in order to make that life cycle work. And I'm of course old enough to remember, you know, back in the 50s when I was a kid, you know, in the fall, sometimes just clouds of monarch butterflies flying overhead when conditions were right for them to work their way south. And, you know, you just don't see that anymore, a reflection of how badly they've declined. But every little bit helps. Every monarch that goes into the population helps a little. I'm not seeing any more questions. Are you?
Suggestions for outreach strategies for reaching large number of private landowners?
Well, that's what a lot of these organizations and federal agencies are doing. Things like the Natural Resource Conservation Service have a very active program. And of course, they deal largely with private agricultural landowners, but they have made a lot of resources available to help the farming, ranching community produce habitat. Other organizations, as I said, are too numerous to count one by one. But here, close to home, the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, their new director is a monarch butterfly specialist. Karen Oberhauser is one of the leading authorities on monarch butterflies. So the University of Wisconsin Arboretum now becomes a very good local source of information on how to help monarch butterflies and other pollinators. Well, I think the question about, you know, are we looking for private lands where we can do the planting? I would say, you know, where that has been most active is with the right-of-ways. Because if you can reach a utility company or a railroad, they control thousands and thousands of acres of these right-of-ways that they manage. So by dealing with one entity, you can potentially change the availability of habitat over a very large area. So a number of organizations are working very actively with the utility companies, with railroads and so forth, the people that own these right-of-ways, to get them to manage those right-of-ways in a different way, essentially to change their management practices. It doesn't really cost them that much more. And I think for many of them, it's now an attractive option because they realize the public goodwill that comes along with the ability to say we're doing the right thing for monarch butterflies.
There are a couple other questions in the chat. One is, or in the question and answer section, one is, why do they mow anyway? And participants noticed a layer of black plastic and some plants along the interstate around Wausau. Do you have any information on that?
I don't specifically, but I do know that the Wisconsin DOT and especially county highways around the state, often when they redo a stretch of highway where they're going to be sort of tearing up the right-of-way anyway, they'll work with local conservation groups to get those areas planted with native wildflowers. So often it's a process of sort of waiting for the right opportunity, which is when they're often doing a lot of work on a stretch of road and making sure that you get to the local highway department to make sure that what they plant there is something that might be useful habitat. And what was the other one? Anne, I'm not seeing the question.
It was, why do they mow at all? Why is mowing the general practice?
You know, I have asked that question any number of times, and it's basically they will say a couple of things. They'll say, well, the public expects it. They like to see clean roadsides. And then they'll say, and it keeps weeds down. Otherwise, we become a source of weeds, and the farmers in the neighborhood complain that the roadsides are producing seeds that are, then landing on their property. And then they'll say, well, it's to prevent collisions with deer, because when there's any type of dense vegetation on the side of the road, deer can sort of be camouflaged there, and motorists won't see them until they jump out on the road, and it causes a collision. And then what else are some of the excuses that, well, they've got to do it for snow plowing, and in some cases it's visibility, that they have to have visibility. Most of these, really don't hold up, because the things that are sort of being proposed often are not, it's not like we're planting shrubbery out there or woody vegetation. These are low-lying plants that don't really sort of impede visibility or provide camouflage for deer. And the types of plants that are going to be deliberately planted there aren't these sort of opportunistic weedy species. These are species that are quite attractive and are not likely to make themselves a nuisance. Now I'm seeing, there's a lot of tiling. Well, yeah, the tiling, of course, drains wet areas, and those wet areas on farms are often areas that are fallow, so to speak, where native vegetation exists as semi-natural or natural vegetation. And it turns out, actually, that some of those wet areas are pretty rich in native milkweed species, so that actually swamp milkweed, as its name implies, grows in wet places. It's actually one of the preferred food sources for monarch caterpillars, because it has very high concentrations of the chemicals that the caterpillars and the monarch butterflies use to defend themselves against predation. So yeah, losing wetlands, in addition to losing habitat for wetland species, it can also essentially remove some of those semi-natural, natural patches of habitat that support milkweeds. The extent of the negative impacts of chemicals, for a lot of the monarch researchers, they really do consider this to be a major part of the problem. And the problem is with glyphosate resistant crops, that farmers are now spraying non-selective herbicides on their fields, which essentially eliminates anything except the resistant crops. So those edges of the field get sprayed. Milkweeds can't come up in amongst the crops. So it really is a major part of the problem, because so much of the monarch's habitat, if you will, occurs on farmland. And it's those fallow areas, or the tolerance of farmers for milkweeds on their property, that's really important, and that has really been impacted by the use of herbicides.
I think we are coming to the end of our time, actually. So unless you saw any other questions or wanted to address anything else, Professor Temple?
I'll make one more thing. The herbicides, of course, are the chemicals that are perhaps, really most significant because of their impact on the plants that the monarchs need. But there's also a class of insecticides, the neonicotinoids, that are causing a lot of problems as well. These were a relatively new class of insecticides that were sort of touted as being less toxic to the environment, but they end up being quite toxic to a lot of wildlife species, and especially things like pollinators and other insects that feed on areas that have been treated with these chemicals. So yeah, it's a combination of a lot of agricultural chemicals being applied to the landscape, and none of them particularly helpful to the monarch butterfly. Somebody has a swamp milkweed. One? Okay. Well, one's better than none, I guess. Well, good. We all need local nature ladies, so I agree. Keep at it. And often, you know, those fallow areas on your neighborhood farms are places where you can talk to the landowner and see whether they might be willing to allow you to help them increase the diversity of plants on those fallow acres. Okay, Anne, I don't see anything more popping up.
I don't see anything either, except for several thank yous for a wonderful evening. And thank you very much from us at the ED Locke Public Library as well. We very much appreciate your time and expertise.
Well, I'd be happy to come back a fourth time. So think about me for future time.
Excellent. We'd love to have you. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much, Professor Temple.
You're very welcome. Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.